The clamshell everyone's been waiting for. This is the exact same internals as the RG35XX Plus, but in SP form. It looks almost exactly like an original GBA SP, although slightly bigger in a few ways. Its bigness makes it look like a knockoff, and that's because it is. It's very similar to one of those devices you'd see at a mall kiosk that's packed with games, except these things have gotten good. The build quality here is good. The emulation quality here is good. And what's most surprising to me is that it plays everything well stock. That means you don't have to do anything to it, like you would have to do with a lot of previous devices from Anbernic, the company that made this. Right out of the box, I barely had to change any settings. This thing just worked. With a design that welcomes tossing in your bag with no protection and a $65 price tag, this thing is certainly one of the ones to get right now, especially if you're new to emulation handhelds. And if you're not, there's plenty of room to tinker here. Because of the popularity of this device, there's a ton of custom firmware out there that allows you to do some pretty wild stuff. There's something here for everybody. In a world where there are 7 of these retro handhelds launching every single week, I was not expecting to like this one as much as I do. This video is sponsored by Trade. Do I have time to make a cup of coffee? Yeah. Hey! Shh! I always leave a light in the room. What do you want? What do you want? What do you want? What do you want?
Mocha. You have decaf?
No, it's frozen! The decaf's frozen! This week's coffee is Bean and Bean. It's Rio Nights with notes of chocolate raisin toasted nuts roasty. Move. That's hot. The reason I'm in a rush is because today, my Nihongo no lesson. Trade is a coffee subscription service that allows you to try all different types of great coffee without having to look for it. Trade sources the best local roasters and brings them right to your doorstep. Sometimes I don't have time to pick out a nice coffee, that's why Trade just gives you one. You want it iced?
Yes.
That takes an extra second. Trade maps your specific preferences to hundreds of different coffee flavor profiles. Their technology pairs you with the best coffee using art and science, marrying industry expertise and machine learning. I got weird pinkies. Don't get a close-up of my pinky. Stop it, I got weird pinkies. It's just we're phoning these ads in. I think we do a great job. Zim, you got a lot of oat milk to lick up.
Little cocktail, Tom Cruise.
Is that a movie?
Yeah, you ever see Cocktail?
That's a Cocktails is the movie?
It's someone who reads a pilot.
What? And you can try it for yourself by going to drinktrade.com/wolfden, and you can get 30% off of your first order. Hachoo! And then there you go. Try it and tell me you love it.
You're gonna take it. Still really good.
Good. All right, I'm late for my appointment. Oh, it's tomorrow.
Wait a second.
The RG35XX is one of my favorite handhelds because it's cheap and it can play a lot of retro systems right out of the box with no tinkering whatsoever. It's the perfect entry point for anyone trying to get into the space. Last year, Anbernic released the RG35XX Plus, which was a small spec bump that added the capability to play a few more systems like N64 and DS. Except, I thought it didn't play those added consoles very well. At the time, I wasn't recommending the Plus because it didn't have custom firmware support, and the firmware that it came with was bad. So if it couldn't play those added consoles very well, and you couldn't put any extra firmware on it to make them play good, why would you get that over the original? This RG35XXSP has the exact same internals as the RG35XX Plus. That means that it can play Game Boy, Game Boy Advance, of course, SNES, but now even N64, Dreamcast, and DS, among others. It being virtually the same as the RG35XX Plus, you'd think I'd hate the emulation quality here. But we're like, what, 5 months removed of my review of the RG35XX Plus? And a lot has changed since then. A lot that I was not expecting. Visually, this thing looks like a weird GBA SP. The build quality is solid, so it doesn't feel like a knockoff, but it definitely looks a little off if you stare at it hard enough. The clicky buttons got a lot of flack from other reviewers, but I love them. You know that I already like clicky buttons, but the original SP also has somewhat clicky buttons. These ones are a bit taller, which is welcome here. The shoulder buttons are exactly the same as the original GBA SP shoulder buttons, with 2 extra added stacked buttons that aren't great to press, but it's fine. They kind of didn't have much choice if they were trying to mimic the original with added functionality. There's also USB-C and HDMI out, which is a huge W over other retro handhelds in the same price range. It does also have a headphone jack, which is a 1-up over even just the original GBA SP. That's right, Nintendo had the courage to remove the headphone jack before Apple did. The whole unit feels big and thick compared to the original GBA SP. The screen feels way bigger. I thought it was because the screen was the same size as the GBA SP, including the black bezels, but it's actually even bigger than that. Everything is bigger. The entire top screen, bottom part, the D-pad is bigger, the bottom is thicker, but the top part is the same thickness. This is kind of what makes it feel a little off. I kind of wish it was the same size as an original GBA SP, but I guess they wanted to shove a whole RG35XX in here without much tinkering. Fortunately, the hinge does feel really good. It feels pretty much identical to the original SP hinge. It has the same articulation. Usually these companies are pretty bad at doing hinges, but this one feels pretty solid. It has auto sleep when you close the clamshell. The original SP does not even have that. Auto wake only works if you open it very quickly for some reason. But I'll warn that while it's asleep, the battery does drain pretty quickly. I think you get about a day of sleep mode. I had it sleeping for about a day, and now we have, I think, 0% battery. It's still on though. So this thing is basically a souped up Game Boy Advance SP, but it does even more than what a Game Boy Advance SP does, except play actual cartridges. Of course, this thing only plays ROMs. When you first boot this thing up, you'll be greeted with a few tabs. Do not ever open the Game Rooms tab. This one tab is what makes this stock firmware bad. I don't know why there are multiple tabs for selecting games, but selecting a game through the Game Rooms tab will have the games run poorly for some reason. They should just get rid of this tab altogether. It's just going to deter people who are going to open this thing up for the first time. It's going to get really frustrating. They're going to be like, why are all my games running so bad? Besides that, if we open all of our ROMs from the RA Game tab, which is the second tab on the home screen, Anbernic did like a surprisingly great job with all of the default aspect ratios, shaders, and borders on this device. Every system looks pretty much right at home on here. Some of these settings that are already applied help make the games run better, but some are a preference thing, like visual adjustments. Luckily, I prefer pretty much everything they did. I love how the GBA SP logo takes up the bottom of the screen, so GBA games are the perfect aspect ratio, and the whole unit looks like a big GBA SP. There's even a drop shadow inside the screen, so it looks like the screen is recessed, and it's not recessed. This is the type of attention to detail that I've been yearning for from these retro handheld manufacturers, even though this is just like a RetroArch setting, but at least they f***ing enabled it by default. There's also a very subtle pixel grid overlay. Not as harsh as like the funny playing Game Boy Color pixel grid overlay, but I like it. Pixel grids like this usually dim the screen a little bit. With these shaders enabled, max brightness of the RG35XXSP is very similar to max brightness of an AGS 101 original Game Boy Advance SP, with slightly brighter whites on the Anbernic. Colors are very similar too on the screen, with more vibrancy on the original SP, believe it or not. Bright colors are brighter on the original, blues are deeper on the Anbernic, and brighter and more saturated on the original. The sky on Sonic Advance is almost teal on the original, so expect some slight color variance. SNES games are set to have pixel-perfect scaling, which gives them an 8:7 aspect ratio, which is alright. I kind of like 4:3 scaling, but I'm not opposed to this. It's still better than awkward integer scaling. Mega Man X's health bar looks fine, which means the scaling is good. However, there is no easy option for reverting to a 4:3 aspect ratio. You're kind of stuck with this pixel perfect 8:7 by default. You have to go to the Super Famicom directory, press the M button, scroll down to RetroArch settings, and turn off Simple Game Menu. From there, you can turn off the overlays, which allow you to run the game at 4:3. This will take up more of the screen and look more closely to how the game plays on an actual CRT. Some people prefer pixel perfect, but I usually prefer 4:3 because that's what you actually play it on a CRT. From there, you can turn integer scaling on, and that will give you some window boxing, but it'll give you a little more clarity. And of course, Super Nintendo here passes the Yoshi's Island test with flying colors. Game Boy games look awesome on here. I don't usually like the pea soup color scheme, but it looks sick. And the weird ghosting that you get with the original DMG Game Boy games is emulated here beautifully by default. If you're getting this for Game Boy or Game Boy Advance, you'll be happy with this right out of the box. From here, I jumped into N64, expecting it to be pretty bad because it was on the Plus. And Mario 64 did look pretty bad at first. The N64 shaders are weird looking. Mario has weird dark spots on his face, and there are some graphical glitches with textures here and there, but for the most part, it runs just fine. I could play a whole game like this. Remember, it is an N64 game. N64 wasn't exactly known for its beautiful textures. One issue is that the D-pad doesn't work as a thumbstick by default. You have to tap the power button once. That switches the D-pad to act like an analog stick. Who would have ever thought to press the power button? It should probably be the select button or any of the other buttons on here. At least it's easy to do. From here, I jumped into Perfect Dark, which often runs bad on these devices. I was surprised to see that it handles Perfect Dark surprisingly well. It's not perfect. There's graphical glitches with the textures every so often. The intro took a while to load, and the intro had some moderate frame skipping. But the gameplay was surprisingly solid. Even areas where it would normally lag, even on original hardware, it seemed just fine on here. Which is weird, because this is the exact same hardware as the RG35XX Plus, and I remember not liking N64 games on there. I guess they updated the firmware? They did a good job. Also, holding R2 in N64 games will make the face buttons act as C buttons, which makes playing Perfect Dark way easier with the limited buttons. This is actually a lot more intuitive to play as it sounds. Having a thumbstick would be better, but this is really meant for Game Boy Advance games and older, so even just being able to play Perfect Dark at this quality at all is a huge bonus. L2 does suck to press on this thing though. Next, I jumped over to DS, which I also expected to be pretty bad on this single screen device, and it was not. It was actually very nice. There are a few quality of life shortcuts that make using DS on a one-screen handheld a lot easier. L2 and R2 will change the screen layout on the fly. There is no touchscreen on here. Pressing the power button once will allow you to move the cursor around with the D-pad and click with the A button. Don't get this for games that require touchscreen input. But for games that are mostly controller focused and will be fine with one screen at a time, this is kind of awesome. It kind of reminds me of those Game Boy Color mods where people will shove a DS Lite into a Game Boy shell. It's kind of a mind to play DS games in an SP form factor.
Dreamcast has the same D-pad mode.
Yep.
Sounds good. I remember this being much worse on the Plus. There is a little bit of slowdown, but I think it's fine.
This is also capable of PSP games, which is also an interesting thing to see played on a Game Boy Advance SP. Those don't run that good on here. By default, PSP is stretched out, but that's an easy fix in the settings. It runs okay. It's not gonna run anything graphically demanding like Gran Turismo or Metal Gear Peace Walker, but it will run like Mega Man X Maverick Hunter with minimal frame skips. Basically, don't get this if you're excited to play PSP games. There's other devices for that. There's a lot more systems that this thing is capable of, but those are all of the ones that I'm usually interested in on these things, and those are the ones that you guys are usually interested in. Anbernic had a lot of time to tool around with the firmware on this thing because it is kind of an older platform, so they had some time to tool around with the firmware, and I think that they did a fantastic job here. Normally, I recommend putting custom firmware on these things if it's easy to do. Usually, that helps optimize all of the emulators to look a lot nicer and helps run the games better. But you don't have to do any of that. As long as you remember not to ever click on the Game Rooms tab, then you'll have a fine time. Everything will be optimized just fine for you. Because this is based on a platform that's been out for quite some time now, there are actually a ton of custom firmware options now for this thing, but I think that they're all in beta. I'm not gonna go into detail on too many of them. I tweeted out asking which ones are people's favorites and if it's worth getting any of them, and people got a little mad at that tweet. Even the guy who makes Garlic OS. Hey man, I'm a big fan of your work. It seems like the ones that people like are Min UI because it has a very nice looking UI and it maintains a sleep-wake function. But it removes Wi-Fi and also takes away N64, Dreamcast, and I think DS support. So that's lame. Even more people seemed happy with MUOS Beans. I have to say beans like that. And it was simple enough to install, so I gave it a try on a second micro SD card that I have. And that's another thing. A lot of these custom firmwares can just be sectioned off on different micro SD cards. So I have one for the stock firmware and one for MUOS Beans. What I like about MUOS is that it doesn't require a specific folder structure. You can just kind of dump your library on here any way that you want. I don't really love this UI. It made me pick an emulator for GBA games and took a couple of tries to actually get to play one. And I wish it looked more like the stock GBA emulator did. But the whole reason people like MUOS is because of Portmaster. Portmaster allows you to play Linux games on here. So people are like taking games from their Steam Deck and getting them to work on here. Of course, it's only gonna work with extremely low powered games, but I've been hearing nothing but great things about it. This is kind of cool. It has a library of free games that you can download. It even has Celeste Classic. Right now I'm playing VVV, and it's a native Linux port that's just working in here. That's kind of sick. And I'm connected to Wi-Fi, so I literally just downloaded it from here. I didn't have to connect it to anything. Although I did notice it only worked on a 2.4 gigahertz connection, so keep that in mind. I'd say right now, the stock firmware is just fine. Sure, the UI doesn't look that pretty, but it's remarkably functional right out of the box. It's kind of sad that functional is the bar that we've set for these things. Retro Game Core also replied to my tweet and had a great breakdown of all of the different custom firmwares that are available right now and why people would want each one and what the trade-offs are. He also said he will have a video out sometime this week. It's probably out by now by the time this video goes up. That will break down all of the custom firmware and show you which one to get if you want any of them. But again, you don't have to mess around. The stock firmware is just fine. He also pointed me in the direction of someone who's been just tweaking all of the settings for the stock firmware to better optimize it. I'm not even sure what extra stuff he's doing, but he's been taking that stock firmware and putting it on GitHub for you to download yourself. But again, I'm going to give this thing the out-of-the-box seal of approval. Again, everything works pretty much just fine out of the box with some minimal tinkering if you want to. And if you don't want to, that's fine too, as long as you don't touch that Game Rooms tab. I'm sure if you want to do some tinkering, there's plenty of stuff out there for you, and you already know what you want to do to it. You don't need to hear from me. The RG35XXSP also has Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. Wi-Fi isn't really that helpful to me, except it helps with Portmaster, but Bluetooth is helpful for using controllers while it's connected via HDMI. Screw this. That's extremely jaggy. Don't try to play Bluetooth on this thing. This is kind of crazy. Anbernic releases a ton of devices, and not all of them are great. In fact, I've been pretty disappointed lately with Anbernic. But this reminds me of the original RG35XX. That was my go-to recommendation for people looking for a retro handheld, especially at that price point. I think this is going to be my new recommendation to people. It's that availability, it's that price point, and it's the fact that everything kind of just works right out of the box. That makes it super easy to recommend. There also seems to be a lot of community support for this thing because I don't want to say it's an older platform, but it's been around for a long enough time where people have been able to tinker with it and done some nice things to it. I think whoever buys this, whether they want to be able to mess around with it or they just want it to work right out of the box, they will be more than happy with it. So long as they don't click on the Game Rooms tab. Make sure if you're like recommending this to somebody or giving it to somebody as a gift, you tell them not to click the first tab. There's something here for people who don't want to mess around at all and just want to get into the game. There's something here for people who want to mess around a lot. I'm sure they'll feel rewarded. And there's something here for people who only want to mess around a little bit. This is the one to get for right now, until the next one comes out in like 2 weeks. Slow down, I only release one video a week. I can't keep up. I will frequently get asked my retro handheld recommendations for like random price points. Someone will be like, hey, I got $111. What handheld should I get? And like, that's not enough information to go off of. So I've compiled an Excel spreadsheet of all the different retro handhelds that I've had the pleasure of tooling around with. And this will change the more I make more of these videos and do more of these reviews. But the link will stay the same. So if you ever feel like being in the market for one of these things, you can just go to that spreadsheet at any point and see where things move and which one's the best as of right now. At least the ones that I'm saying are the best. Other reviewers are gonna have different opinions. Other subreddits are gonna have different opinions. If you want my opinion, there it is. It's right there in a spreadsheet. So what do you guys think about the RG35XXSP or the Game Boy Advance SP of Anbernic handhelds? Is this something that is finally gonna get you to pull the trigger on a retro handheld? Have you been just jonesing for this clamshell form factor? It's all the rage. It's like it's early 2000s again. People are eating this shit up. Leave it in the comments below. At me on Twitter, any and all of this other social media garbage. We got streams over on twitch.tv/WulffDen all the time. We got a podcast, youtube.com/WulffDenPodcast. But the most important thing you can do to help support this channel is just subscribe right here and share this video with a friend who finally wants to get one of these things. Thank you very much. Have yourself a good week.